Hi guys. So today I'm just going to be talking a little bit about Flutter, what it is, how and why it got developed, and of course, what its future is. So firstly, what is Flutter? Flutter is a UI framework for building apps in iOS, Android, the web, and for desktop. This includes Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and even some embedded flavors of Linux. Also, apparently, it supports Google Fuchsia, whatever that is. Flutter is free and open source, which is nice. It was developed by Google. Since it's released by Google, it's been picking up quite a bit of steam. Its community is quite active and passionate. Flutter is not a framework or a library. It is a complete SDK. This means that it includes a rendering engine, ready-made widgets, testing and integration APIs, and virtually all the tools, libraries, and documentation that you need to develop cross-platform applications. I just want to talk a little bit about this photo here. You might realize that the Flutter framework uses Dart. When developing in Flutter, you will be using this programming language, which was also developed by Google and launched in late 2011. It's quite easy to use and to learn. It is a typed object programming language. And if you know JavaScript, Dart syntax is quite similar to that. In production, Dart compiles to native machine code. So, that'll be native ARM64 or x86-64, which means that your graphics will render beautifully on any platform. To get a better idea of where Flutter came from, I just made this little timeline that we can quickly run through. So Flutter 1.0 was the first stable version of Flutter. It was released on December 11th, 2019. At this time, Flutter was mostly focused on Android development, and iOS support was still quite shaky. On May 6th, 2020, Flutter 1.17 was released, adding support for the Metal API, which vastly improved performance on iOS, as well as new material widgets for Android, finally making it a viable tool for both Android and iOS development. This is also around the time I got into Flutter. On March 3rd, 2021, Google released Flutter 2.0. This update brought official support for web-based applications with the new Canvas kit renderer, a whole bunch of web-specific widgets, as well as early access to desktop support. But the biggest change, of course, was the release of Dart 2.0, which moved to null safety, which we'll get back to later. On September 8th, 2021, Flutter 2.5 was released. This update brought a bunch of new widgets for Google's Material U design, which was new at the time, as well as making support for Apple Silicon stable. Most recently, on May 12th of this year, Flutter 3.0 was released, finally bumping the number of supported platforms to 6, through including stable support for Windows, Linux, and Mac OS on both Intel and Apple Silicon processors. So that's kind of where Flutter is at the moment. But why even bother? Why should you care? Well, speaking from personal experience, I think what makes Flutter really unique and nice to work with really come down to 3 main pillars. Firstly, performance. Performance is a main pillar of Flutter. Every single keynote, talk, seminar, whatever I've ever watched has always mentioned performance, and there's a good reason for that. Flutter is incredibly performant. You really have to be doing something stupid to get bad performance. And I would know because I've gotten bad performance before, quite a lot. And when you do start getting bad performance, Flutter makes it very easy to see exactly why you are getting bad performance. It provides you with a whole suite of dev tools that you can use. Flutter renders at a consistent 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second for devices which support it. In performance benchmarks, Flutter consistently outperforms both React Native and Xamarin in terms of launch times and frames per second, as well as coming really close to native performance. Secondly, this is a big one, community. You might think because Flutter is still relatively new, its community support might be lacking, but it's exactly the opposite. I've already mentioned Flutter's rapidly growing popularity. Flutter already also has over 143,000 stars on GitHub versus React's natives, 104,000. I also just want to mention PubDev, which is the official package repository for Dart and Flutter. If you need a widget for your app, chances are that you can find it on PubDev. I remember when this was not always the case. I used to have to write a lot of my own widgets from scratch, but now you can just go to this website and borrow them from PubDev, which currently has over 24,000 packages. Lastly, Flutter is easy. It's easy to understand. It's easy to make really good looking UIs with Flutter and have them be consistent across all of your platform. In Flutter, everything is a widget. It's widgets all the way down, which means that you can think of everything as building blocks. Compare this to other approaches that use different objects like layouts, views, controllers, etc., where Flutter just has a consistent and unified object model. Any object in Flutter is a widget, from a button to padding to a font, everything. If you need a native-looking Cupertino action sheet, simply go to Flutter's own widget catalog and use the built-in Cupertino action sheet. If you need anything else, simply go to PubDev and basically drag and drop in your code. Now, of course, not everything in the garden is always rosy, and there are some downsides to consider before looking at Flutter as well. Firstly, Flutter is still relatively new and immature. It is being worked on and developed actively by the team at Google, as well as members of the community. And you might run into some growing pains. The biggest one I can think of as a great example was, like I mentioned earlier, when Flutter migrated to null safety with Flutter 2.0. That did break quite a lot of my code. I had a very large code base, which I started working on well before the migration to null safety, that I just opened one day and it had over 5,000 errors, which is never nice to see. Now, some of that was, of course, my fault. You know, this was a very large project and the first one I made with Flutter. But yeah, it didn't help. Now, I didn't know this at the time, but Flutter did have a tool to help you migrate your code to null safety. And even without that, you could still compile and build your code with null safety turned off, which is what I ended up doing. I think it's what I still do with that code base. Yeah, I still haven't moved that code base over to null safety, and I probably never will. I've listened to a lot of talks by the Flutter engineers, and minimizing code breaking changes really are a priority to them. But just be aware that you might need to make some small changes like this every now and then. And then secondly, well, Flutter was developed by Google, and well, they don't have the best track record now, do they? But that brings me to the title of this talk, the future of Flutter. I don't think that Flutter is going anywhere anytime soon. Like I mentioned earlier, Flutter has become incredibly unpopular and successful for Google. There are over 400,000 apps developed using Flutter on the Google Play Store, a couple of which are my own. Many of these also include Google's own apps, which they have been rewriting using Flutter, as well as a lot of really big third parties. I think it was announced recently that Toyota will be using Flutter to build out all of their infotainment systems moving forward. And those run on something called Automotive Linux. And I think that kind of also speaks to what Google's goal is with Flutter, and that is having Flutter be kind of the standard for building UIs on any platform. And with Flutter Desktop now moving into a stable beta, I really think that they've been progressing towards that goal rather well. So yeah, I would say that if you're thinking of developing your next billion-dollar unicorn app, definitely consider Flutter. It will definitely help you bring something to market quickly. And not only that, but something that is very performant and visually appealing. And you could also deploy that to many platforms at the same time from the same code base with very minimal effort, which is always very nice. Yeah, thank you. That is all from me.